Crayon Resist works is that you have a white crayon. And the white crayon will be used to trace over these lines. Now if you're doing a watercolor painting, normally when you're working with the brush you have to be careful to go up to the edges of lines, like with the blue or whatever, and your brush is what's causing the edges of the lines to form. When you do a Crayon Resist watercolor, you're putting crayon down and the crayon is waxy, so the water of the watercolors that you're painting with will not stick to the waxy crayon area. So it forms a natural barrier on all these places that you have lines, and it forms a sort of crenellated barrier, because when you draw with a crayon it's not a perfectly straight line. There's sort of little wiggly edges to it, and I really like that look of it, the look of having the little wiggly edges along the connection points. So it's one way of painting it, and we might as well show you something a little more interesting than just doing a straight watercolor. So what I'm going to do now is trace over each of these lines. Now I will comment that crayons, by their nature, are generally not very thin things. They're sort of thick. So this would not be the type of technique you would want to necessarily try if you were doing something with a lot of little fine detail. Like if you were doing intricate guitar or something that had lots of little tiny close lines, because the crayon wouldn't be able to draw them for you very well unless you really sharpened it down into a point. So this is better suited for things of this kind of folk art style, where you've got a number of biggish lines, and it's these biggish lines that you want to trace out. And you could do anything in whatever style you want. You are the artist, and you get to decide what you want it to look like. So again, everything that I draw with the crayon, the watercolor will not be able to stick to. The wax will resist it, which is why this is called a wax resist or a crayon resist. Part of the challenge is that you are drawing in white on a white surface. So it's hard to see what you've drawn at this stage because the white just blends in with the white. And especially in this case where I made the black so super dark because I wanted you to be able to see it on your monitor. So the way to know what you have drawn is if you hold it a little at an angle, the crayon area looks shiny, and you might not be able to see that well on your screen, but when you have something in person you'll be able to see how the crayon area shines in the light. So it's good to check every once in a while and make sure that you have traced in crayon everything that you want to be able to resist, because if you don't, then you will end up having a area that is not resisting the way that you thought it was going to. And that could be confusing and or frustrating if you just spent a number of hours working on something and then you get to one section of it and it doesn't end up being the way that you wanted. So it's always good to check beforehand, just like when you're doing the tracing part. Make sure you've traced everything you want to trace. Make sure you have crayon resisted everything that you want to crayon resist, because it's better to do that early and to check twice than to be sad later on because you missed something. And again, I'm sort of just doing this rough and quick so you can see the technique. You could do this slow and steady if you want to have a more specific kind of outline. So my little house over here, see, it's going to be tough for me to draw these little windows, so I think I will not do the little windows with the Crayon Resist style because they are going to be too small to try to get the details in with this crayon that I've got. Alright, so we got a tree. We've got the little house. We've got a little bush over here. We've got the windows. We've got the front. We've got the dome. Alright. I think I've got everything on there that I want to resist. Alright, so to summarize again, if you're doing a crayon resist or wax resist, the purpose of the white crayon is to, in essence, make a little wax boundary around the edges that you're working with. And this wax boundary will provide a point that the watercolor comes up against and stops at, and also that stays white. So if these were very light pencil lines, then you would barely be able to see them, and there would just be white spaces in your drawing. So again, I'm doing this dark so that you can see it, but most of the time if you use this technique, you're making those lines much lighter. But as you are the artist, it is up to you how you want them to look. Alright, so we're going to start with a big brush, and we're going to go with the blue and do the blue background. Some people like to do the foreground first. I like to do the background. I will also note that when Vern did his oil painting version of this scene, he actually used tape, and he taped off all of these areas that he wanted to be white. So the white areas were all covered with tape, and then he painted, and he was able just to paint willy-nilly to get the sky and stuff in. And then once that had dried, then he peeled off the tape, and that meant all of this stayed nice and white. So if you're doing that kind of technique, that's something to think about, that you can cover this up with tape, and you'd have to be pretty careful about taping, you know, just exactly the little nooks and crannies in here. But it would mean that when you put the sky, you could just brush the sky completely over, and then when you're done, peel up the tape, and that would still stay nice and white. And there's also stuff called masking fluid where you could do the same thing, where you could paint in with a smaller brush, clearly, paint in the covering up material so that this all was protected, paint your sky and stuff over it, and then you rub off the masking material. But we're going to do this simple today. So we're doing this with Crayon Resist. Get some water on our brush. Get my favorite blue, which is why I keep running out of it and having to refill it. A little more blue. So one technique for painting with watercolors is to paint with the watercolor color with the paper being dry. So that's what I'm doing right now. And the paint only goes into the areas that I touch. So like the paint's not going over here, or it's not going over here. It's only going where my paintbrush actually contacts the paper. So this is a way to have a little more control over what you are doing, if control is your aim in life. So this is called wet because the brush is wet, on dry because the paper is dry. But if we wanted to do it in a different way, right, so my brush right now is clean because I've rinsed it off. So you have just water. There's no paint at all on here right now. So I'm painting this other side over here, this side, with water. I'll go along the edges of the trees. So now the paper is wet. And now, let's just make it a little more wet down here. Now if I get some color on my brush and just touch in here, see how it blossoms out? So you have a lot less control when you do wet on wet, but it makes these really pretty designs for you. And I can even brush this out a little bit. See how it sort of flows out like a river into the water that is all in the paper? So this creates what you might say a more natural effect, because the paint is just flowing on its own. It's flowing and expanding. The trick with wet on wet is that this water that I painted the scene with evaporates pretty quickly. So you have to move pretty fast if you want to be able to, well, depending on how wet or dry. I suppose if you lived in a really humid area, it might dry more slowly. I happen to be in an area that is fairly dry right now. So this will dry fairly quickly and give me only a little bit of time to work. I'll just go along the edges of this. So when I'm coming up to the edges of the church, the paint is naturally stopping when it hits that crayon. So another benefit, if you are new to watercolors, is that you don't have to be quite as good at following lines with your brush, because when it hits the edge of the crayon, it's naturally going to resist against the edge of the crayon, and it will stop at that point. You see, when you're painting on this area that is already very wet, the colors just sort of, can you see that? How it's just expanding on its own? And that forms like there's little clouds in there. Whatever kind of look you want to be. So it's up to you what kind of a sky you want to make. When he took that picture, this is Vern's picture that we're working with, it was a very cloudless blue sky. It was quite pretty. But if you want, you are the artist, you can put in clouds, you can put in birds. But see how that has a different kind of feel to it than this sky over here? Usually you want to do everything one way, but we're testing out techniques here. So that is fine. And I don't know if you can see, but my water is just coming up to that crayon edge, and it's stopping because the wax is resisting against it. Now I'm just painting over here with water again, but because this blue is still wet, it is sucking, this paintbrush is just water, but it's sucking the blue color down from the upper areas, and it is all merging together a little. So this is another fun thing about watercolors, is that you can merge the old with the new. You can make layers. Watercolor is great for layering with. Usually with layers, you want the bottom layer to dry, and then you work on the next layer up. And usually when you're painting in watercolors, you put in the lighter layers first, and then the darker layers over them. Oh, now see? I forgot I had a bush there, but I don't know if you can see that. Push it up a little. There's a wiggly line right there, which is where the edge of the bush is. So the Crayon Resist can also help you remember what your plans were. And it doesn't matter that I put a little blue down there, because the green will go right on top of that. In general, with most watercolors, you can see through them. So if I'm painting this blue, and then I paint something that's green on top of it, you'll still be able to see a little of the blue underneath. So it gives a little bit of shading to things. But if you get really dark, if I made a super dark brown or something like that and wanted to put a bird up here, the dark brown would be dark enough that it would block out the blue that was underneath it. But in general, it's very hard to put light things on top of dark things. So if I made a super dark shadow in there, it would be hard to put a white bird on top of the dark shadow. That's where you get into things like this bleed-proof white that then helps you put light colors on top of existing darker colors. Let me just catch in the blue edges here. Alright, so we got a sky. I'm going to soften up the edges a little there. Laura said that she did her version of the church in oil for the phone book. Let's see. I would love to see that if you have it around somewhere. At some point, not right now. Alrighty. So, you get the general idea. So you can paint with wet paint on dry paper, and you get one sort of technique, or you can get the scene wet with water and then drop in your colors into the wet paper, which gives you a different kind of effect. And it's good to practice with these two techniques and see what you like for which kinds of situations. I got a little hair in there. I'll get that out later. Fortunately, if you get hairs in watercolor, I think, it's a bristle from my brush. Usually once everything dries, you're able to just brush it right off, and it won't affect the painting itself, so I won't worry about that right now. Because I didn't tape this down, the paper's actually buckling a little in places where it got extra wet, so you can probably see that. And something to think about when that happens is now the water is pooling down into the little valley areas, like see right there, it's pooled down into this valley area, so that can affect the lightness and darkness of your paper. So one solution, if you are taking a lot of time to do your painting, is to tape down the edges so it's nice and flat. You can pre-wet it all so that it all goes through this whole buckling and drying and then gets nice and flat, so that it doesn't do it when you're actually painting your painter. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can deal with this challenge. Or you can just accept that it's part of the fun of watercolors, that it's going to do these kinds of things. Alright, so we have a sky. Alright, maybe a little bit more blue over here. Yep, you can see, look, I can find the edge of my bush based on the Crayon Resist there. Alright, trees. The trees in this picture are green, but when we went out there on Wednesday, they were all turning, and they looked very pretty while they were turning. So I think I'm going to make them more of this maroonish color. I like to test my colors a little. It's a little more purple than I want. It's worth it to note that watercolors dry lighter than they appear at first. So if you're trying to get, that's more the color I'm looking for. We'll start it out with this kind of a red. Leave some little holes in it. And I'll toss in a little bit of orange. And see, the same thing is happening. I started with the red, which then made the paper wet, and now when I drop in orange, it sort of blossoms out and spreads and gives it a more natural effect. We'll go up here on the edges. Bring it along here. Add in a little bit of brown. So the other thing to think about is that your scene is being lit, and you could tell by the shadows, usually, what direction the sunlight's coming from. If we look at this original picture, the sun is coming from over on this side, because if you look over here, the steeple is casting a shadow back behind it. So if the sun is over here, then this side will be lighter, and this side over here will be a bit darker. So the same would be true for any sorts of objects in the scene, including this tree. So we'll get a little bit of brown and mix it with a little bit of red. And put a little bit of darker colors over on this side here, because that's the side that's more in shadow. And in general, the bottom of the tree tends to be more in shadow. So clearly we're just doing a very rough version of this scene. This is not going to be a super realistic version in the time that we've got available, but we're just giving you different ideas and different techniques to work with. Alright, so we got a tree shape. There should be a bush shape over here. Take a look at that. I like that color for it. Part of the benefit of having a watercolor tin like this is that you end up with these little splotches of color, which then you can use later on if something seems like it will work well with that color. Right. So we got this little bush over here. Now this whole bush pretty much is in the shadow because it's all in the shadow of the church, although there's more shadow right up against the church, and then there's a section over here that got caught in the light. So we're going to use a bit darker red and put it up close to the church, and little bits down here at the bottom. There we go. So again, this all ends up drying lighter, but the beauty with watercolors is that you let a layer dry and then you go in with another layer and you end up with something quite lovely in the end. But we're showing you techniques here. Alright, so we'll put a little bit of more shadows over here. There's shadows down there. Lower area. Just random little textures in there. Alright. Next up, let's tackle the grass, because the grass is the next big swath. And even with the grass, you can see that it's brighter over here, and that there's a shadow over here, which is probably cast by that tree right there. So we'll have different shades of green. So we got the green of the grass here. We'll start with the basic green. You want to not get too close to the existing wet, because if I were actually to touch these two things together, the red would bleed out into the green and it would just make this long swath of red into the green, which is not what I am looking for. So normally when you're painting this sort of thing, you would wait for that layer to dry before you start working on the green layer. So we're just working a little quickly here to get this done in a short time period for you, so you can see the different techniques. So we're going to put in more of the green over here, and maybe a slightly darker green. How's that one? Yeah, so we'll put this in for the shadow. The shadow goes up to about here. So in general, this is something to think about when you're doing your painting. The more that you have these different shades and tones and textures, the more that the painting comes to life, because in general, even though the sky looks blue, there is generally, different shades of blue going on in there, and the more that you can reflect that and the little bits of clouds and so on, the more your painting comes to life, and the more the human eye sees it as something that would actually happen in the real world. Alright, let's tackle the little house to the side of it, and I think I'm going to switch over to a slightly smaller brush here. Alright, that one is a little stiff. How about that one? Alright. So this little house over here to the side is sort of a cream yellow color. So we'll try this. Alright, it's a little too yellow. Let's try this one. Mix it. Yeah, that's better. Try with some of this. Yep, so sort of part of the process is playing with the colors you have available to you and mixing them up. And I happen to have this tin, so I bought this as an empty tin, and then I bought a bunch of different paint tubes and colors that I like. And this is the most cost-effective way to do it, because you can buy paint tubes in whatever price range you're able to afford and put them into the different spots, and you just put in a little at a time. And it's okay that they dry out, because they just rehydrate with water, so there's no problem at all with them drying completely out. So the reason you want them to stay wet in the tin is so you can squish them out into these squares. But once you squish them out into the square, then you are all set in terms of having exactly the colors that you want. If you run out of a particular color, then you could add more in. In comparison, as much as I love this tin over here, you can see I really liked that green and those blues. Well, those are now gone, and you can't buy those particular colors to re-put them in. They want you just to buy the whole tin again. So that would be a shame, because you can see like I've barely used this red or this purple, but I've used the colors that I really like pretty much down to the bottom. So that becomes less useful for me as a set once that happens. But when I use this set over here, if I run out of like that blue, I just pick up my little blue, I mean this isn't blue, but you pick up the tube that you want and you just squish some more color in there, so it makes it much less expensive to work on it that way. And then what you do, so I can figure out where I put it, is you make yourself a key. Just a second, I think it's over here. This is Vitalauret. Alright. Yeah, so I made myself a key that looks like this, and I deliberately painted it dark on one side and then lighter on the other side so I could see the different ranges of colors that a given paint will make for me. And that way I can see what they look like when they've dried on this particular kind of paper. So it's good to make yourself a key. It's super easy to do. You just draw a bunch of grid squares and then you say which color you've put into each spot. And that way if we run out of one, like I'm always running out of that one, which is a fifth from the side, which is the ultramarine blue. So then when I run out of that, I just grab my ultramarine blue tube, squish some more into the cube, and I am good to go again. Alright, so hopefully while I was explaining that, this has dried a little bit, because I don't want my colors to blend together where I don't want them blending. So let's go back and get this yellow that we've been working on, and it's just this little house area here. So I switched down to a smaller brush so I can be more detailed. See, now I'm resting my palm against that. Yeah, so that's pretty dry over there. Alright, so if you recall, I did not crayon resist these little tiny windows because they would have been too small to try to draw around with my crayon. So in this case, if I care about this, I need to be more attentive to where I'm painting, because there is no artificial guidelines helping me with that. It's just where I stop painting with the brush. Alright, so now I've got my house that is sort of cream colored. Alright, next up. We'll work on, how about the roof? You want to do the lighter things before you get onto the darker things. Well, I suppose I can do the side of the building. Now, while that is white-ish, it is not a pure white. And I want to give it a little bit of a yellowish tinge, which is what I see there when I look at that. So, we'll take this and I will clear an area out here. I find rather than actually taking a paper towel and rinsing all this stuff away, that I like keeping it, because there are times when I'll be working on a painting and I'll look over on the side and I'll say, oh, that color there is exactly the kind of brown that I want, and I've got it right there. And like I said, again, it doesn't matter if it's dried, like this green stuff here is dry, but if I just add a little water, it moistens right back up again. It becomes usable again. So none of that is wasted over there. Those are all just pretty colors that are ready for use with a little bit of water. So now that I've got a clear spot, let's try mixing. We want a very mild yellow for the side of the church. This will be very loose. So that looks bright yellow, but once we start adding water to it and stretching it out, it's going to become very mild. Alright, so we'll paint in the church area. And I'm going reasonably fast because I'm trying to do a bunch of different things here with you. But if you went slow and careful, then you could get exactly the look you're looking for. And remember also that this is going to dry lighter than it looks at first blush. So don't, when you're painting something, don't judge it by what it looks right now necessarily. Think about what it'll look like when it's a little lighter. But you can then add some water. So right now I'm rinsing the color off my brush and just getting it wet. And in essence, you're diluting it now. So I'm just dragging the color because I want it just to be the tint of cream. Because when you look around at things in nature, very few things are blaring pure white. There's usually some sort of a color cast to them. There we go. Because this isn't a solid surface, it's not like stucco, it's planks. So you want these little sense of plank boards in there, and each plank therefore has its own little shadow. All that kind of stuff is going on. Alright, so then the roof is roof colored, and we've got the steeple part. And this next section of the steeple. There'll be little roof bits in there, but we can add those in after because they're darker. The darker color will go right over this lighter color, so that's not a problem. Go up to the top of the steeple. Alright, so that's roof, that's column, that's the side of the building, that's a front column. There's a little gap in there that you can see the sky through. We will deal with that later. Alright, so we got the basis of the church in here. And again, you generally want to think about light to dark, because now when we want to put darker shadows over this, that will work fine. But if we tried to lighten up a shadow, that would be trickier to do. Although not impossible. Few things are actually impossible. Alright, so now we've got the church set in. So now I want to make this house over here a little yellower, because you can see how light that dried. So we'll put this down, we'll get back our littler brush. So this is layer 2 now on this little house. The more layers you put on, the richer the color gets, the more that it's blocking the light of the paper behind it. Because when you're looking at watercolors, part of what you're seeing is the light bouncing through the watercolor layer down to the paper itself and then reflecting back at you, so it almost looks backlit in that sense. So the more layers you put on it, the more you're blocking the light and just seeing the color itself that you have put down on the paper. Alright, see, so it's a little darker now. Let's add a little bit of green. We'll use this green. So this front shadow area, that would be a little braver and get a little closer to the tree, because I think that that is drying in there now. But I don't want the colors to run together. And also, like I said, this is a folk art style. So in a folk art style, the colors are a little more simplistic, the shapes are a little more simplistic. So you can see how it's very flat, two-dimensional. And that's the way that these images tend to be. But in your painting, you can do whatever style you want. It is your creation. Add a little green at the shadow there. Alright, that looks good. Put a little bit of shadow over here under this bush. Alright, so while that layer is drying, let's do the foundation. The foundation is sort of a gray color. We'll get some gray here. Let's dilute that down a little bit. All right. So this little layer in here is the foundation layer. So if you were doing a straight, nope, kitty, now is the wet paint time, so now is the time that you can't come over here, because you'll have little footprints going all over the place. I know, you want to be a part of this. So the cat is laying right there now on the keyboard. Oh wait, cat's typing something, hold on. No, sweetie, you can't sit actually on the keyboard. Oh. So let me put the keyboard to the side so the cat does not type things. Close that so I can see what's going on. Alright. You're a very good kitten. You're a very good kitten to be so helpful. So helpful and supportive. Alright, so now we've got the foundation, which goes to the front column, which is there, and then stops. Alright, we want it to be a little darker over here. Alright, we're going this way. There we go. Right, so now we got the foundation set. And over here we're going to put a little bit of brown. Oh, that looks like a good brown in front of the house for the road. Alright, so far so good. Alright, next up, roof. So roofs tend to be sort of brownish, dark brownish, as you can see there. Alright, I think I want a medium-sized brush. Alright, we got a medium-sized brush for the roof. We want a dark brownish. We have a nice starting brown over here, but it needs to be a little darker. So try adding that black gray that we were working with over into that and see what it is. See, so this brown stuff we made is coming in useful. That's sort of the right color. Maybe a little red in there. There we go. There we go. That's more of the color I'm seeing. So now we're going to put this in here. And we're probably going to have to do a layer or two of this to be able to get this to show up properly. And we'll put this over here. Oh, the cat is back. You just have to convince. Good kitty, yes. Alright, kitty is nuzzling my arm, so if this ends up getting moved a little, you'll know it's because of the arm getting hit. Alright, get the roof in there. So again, this isn't quite dark enough on the first pass of what I want, but I'll do a second pass of it, and that should get it closer to the full darkness that I'm aiming for. So we got the roof there. We got the little roof area over here. And then we got this thing here. And then this section over here. With the little detail lines. A little bit of detail over here. Over here. And then the next thing is this little layer over there. And then this section over there. Alright, and then the back of here. I don't think I want to do that in the dark brown for the back side of the, I'll do that in a darker of the yellow. So we will go here, and then we will add the lower house. The lower house is actually a little darker color, but again we can fix that with a second or third pass. So we will not worry about getting it super dark right now, we just worry about it getting it started in the direction of its darkness. And I can see that this is not exactly as straight as one might have hoped, but that's alright. Again, we did this rough and quick to give you an idea of how this works. Alright, so we got the first pass done for the browns. Now we're going to do another pass. Normally I'd let it dry more, but again we're going quick and efficient this way. And there's a lower level. I suppose I could start it now. And I could just darken it up on a second pass. There we go. Alright. So the wetter that you make this, the longer it will take to dry. So it extends your painting time. There's something to keep in mind. So we will make this a little darker over here. Alright, so I think the windows are a little bluer. They're darker and bluer when I look at them. So I will make an area, start an area over here. So we get some of these dark grays. Alright, maybe not quite that blue. There we go, that's more the blue I was thinking about. So again, with this being, I don't want to just let's put some brown in it. I don't just want to put black in there, because in the real world, very few things are just solid black, but it does need to be dark. So the more that you can put in, just put a little gray. Oh, sweetie, this is wet now, so you can't come over here. We'll try going with that. Oh, now the cat is eating the end of my paintbrush. Good kitty. Nope. I know you like eating the ends of paintbrushes. You are so helpful. Yes, you are such a helpful little kitty. Well, now Cat's trying to use my arm as a pillow, which normally I would sit and let her do, but then my hand would be trapped for quite a while. That would not make the video quite as useful. Hello, kitty. Are you helping? You are so helpful. Yes, so helpful. Where are you going to lay your head? Well, I suppose that's a piece of sky, so that piece is alright. It's okay, you can lay your head over there. It's alright. You are a good kitten. So this is Zuzu the cat. We have a pair of siblings. Felix is the boy and Zuzu is the girl. They were the last two of their litter, so I brought them both home. And that was exactly 3 years ago yesterday. So she is about 3 years and 6 weeks old. I got them when they were tiny kittens. Yes, you're a good kitten. Alright, so clearly that's not quite as dark as I want to make them. Sweetie? No, that's still wet. I don't want your paw to be watercolored. Right, you can chew a little on the edge of the brush. Is that nice and yummy? Nice and chewy. I did get them catnip sticks so they could chew on actual catnip sticks, but for some reason they like the wooden ends of these brushes. I think mostly because I'm actually using them and as a toy for them to play with me. And it's nice and chewy. Alright, you done chewing for a little while? Alright, let's put a little more layers of brown onto the roof. And again, because I didn't tape the watercolor paper down, you can see it sort of pools in the valleys. So that's something to think about when you are painting. If you like that kind of natural effect, then you can know how to make it. And if you don't want that kind of effect, then you know to tape it down or take the other steps to make sure that the paper stays flat. Alright, so we make these back sides, because remember the sun's over on this side, shining this way, so these sides are in shadow. Right, the cat has left, so I'm able to actually get closer into what I'm doing again. So it's lighter on this side and darker over on this side. So you want to think about that when you are doing your image. If you're doing an image that has shadows, which most images that you work on, well, even if you do a still life of fruits and vegetables, there still generally are shadows in some directions. and it's good to reflect those. Alright, let's add a little more gray to our blue. And do another round of darkening out the windows. Something else you want to think about when you're painting is the values, which is the lights and darks of things. In general, the human eye likes it when a scene has some light areas and some dark areas, and that also helps control how the viewer's eyes moves through the picture, because the eye tends to be drawn to light areas. So if someone were to look at this image, their eye would tend to be drawn to the big focal area, which is the nice bright light area at the middle. I'm going to put in these little windows now. So by changing what areas are light and dark in the image, you control how the viewer's eye moves through it. And also, as you've probably seen yourself in landscapes, things that, like when mountains are far away, they tend to get bluer and cooler. So you also control a sense of depth by the kinds of colors that you use. Alright, so there is a little bit of sky poking through in this nook. So let me put that in now. I don't want it to be too dark. That goes over here. Alright. And there's also a little bit of sky poking through here. And this will be a question of how much space I left in the Crayon Resist for this hole to poke through. Well, that actually worked reasonably well. Okay, so we got a little bit of that poking through. A little bit of roof poking through. And then a little bit of the yellow house poking through. Alright. There we go. So now we get the sense that there's a little gap there. And, oops, sorry, in that column area. Alright, so now let's think about the back sides of the steeple. That's going to be yellow, but a darker yellow, and it's tending towards brown, so it's sort of this yellow color mixed with this brown color. We do that. See, so now we're getting to the shadow. Normally, I'd let this other layer dry. I'm a little worried about the other shadows merging into this. But since we're going quick, we'll do it quick and we'll just see what happens. Trying not to touch down into the brown of the darker shadows because I don't want them to all bleed together. Alright, and a shadow in here. Now also, this front side has a little bit of brickwork. So it's not in the shadow, that's actually in the light. But you want to give that sense of a little bit of brickwork. And there's also a little brickwork on this section here. And then the next section over here is part of the front of it. It's got a bit of a different texture. in the column. All right. Now the inside of this area actually has a little bit of texture right underneath the opening. And then you can see the front wall and the roof. I want to make sure that blue dries so that it doesn't get all merged in here. And that area is even a little darker than the shadow, so I'm going to pull over a little more of the blue into my, or brown, sorry, more of my brown into my brown yellow mixture. And then put that in that spot. Right, like that. I think there's crayon over there. It's doing its resist job. Alright, like that. Alright, this area under the roof should be a little darker. Add a little brown to this section here. There we go. Add another layer in there. It's good to have these different sections in slightly different colors so that they differentiate a bit more. So it makes more clear that this is another section of the roof. So we got that in there. And this house roof down here has a little bit of blue to it. So I'm going to paint a little blue over it. And you can see it doesn't look blue, it gives it more of a gray tone. So by adding layers to things, you can add shades of color. There we go. See, like that? Alright, the gray of the windows is still not quite dark enough. So add a little bit of darker gray. There we go. But by doing this in layers, rather than just putting all of one color on it, it gives it depth. And also it does a better job of blocking the paper, which is what we're aiming for here, so that it doesn't glow quite as much. And it's good to have these sections of very dark, or relative dark. You know, you don't want them to be pit voids into the abyss, but areas of relative dark against areas of relative white, because it adds visual interest to the image. Alright. Now, normally in watercolors, if you wanted to add the light at the very end, that would be hard to do with a traditional watercolor because it just wouldn't show up well against the darkness. But that's why you get the bleed-proof white stuff. That's the one special paint that I do buy, because then you can put white colors on the top of dark colors at the end to be able to get something to pop out. Alright, so see how this looks like it's more in the foreground because it's darker, and then this one looks more like it's in the background because it's got the lighter windows? So if I made those windows back there too dark, it would make that be too prominent. But we want the eye to be drawn to this thing here, so we want to put most of the brights and darks and details and everything in this section, and then let that other thing fade to the background. And this tree here has some nice darks, and that brings forward, and that's good because this tree is supposed to be sort of in the foreground, and then the church and then back into these little things. And this bush, I think, looks reasonably good, like it's up against the church. And maybe it's a little further back, and that's fine. Alright, there's a windmill, a wind vane. There's a wind vane on the very top of this. And for some reason, it looks almost black in this picture, but I was pretty sure it was more gold in real life. Maybe it was the way the shadows were on it. But in any case, I'm not going to be painting a super realistic wind vane. I'm just going to be putting a little black, putting a little hint of something up there. There we go. Alright, wind vane. So one alternative is to actually sit there and paint in all the little white stripes, which I don't think would go well with this general soft style of the painting for the panes of the glass. Another option would be to gently sketch them in with the teeniest little brush. Even this one wouldn't do the job. Those are still wet. Well, one solution people use is a hair dryer to get it to dry nice and quick. But since we are just doing the quick and easy to see option here, I will just show you in general how it would work. And the chances are that this will run a little bit, but that's okay. Alright, I think out of all these windows that this bottom one here is the driest. So we'll see what happens. Alright, so when I'm doing this, I tend to, you only need a little tiny amount of white, so I tend just to pick it out of the roof, the lid area. With the tiniest little thing. Now see, in actuality, there's 24 tiny little panes. I am not going to sit here painting in 24 tiny little panes, so we'll just put a cross piece. Yeah, and see how it's bleeding? But that's okay. So normally I would wait for this to be a little drier, but we're just getting a sense of how this works here. And you can see that the white does show up against the darker color, which in most cases would not happen. See, I just don't think that I want to go putting in the tiny details. It's all about how you want to give the impression. You know, with my trees, I did not draw on every leaf. My windows, I don't want to draw on every pane. But I do want to give the general sense that they have panes. So when you do your image, you can do it however you want. well, it gives sort of the sense that there are panes there, but I did not draw in 24 individual little tiny panes to give that sense. Alright. Done with the white. Alright. So that was obviously very, very quick. You could spend a lot more time doing a watercolor painting, but hopefully this gives you a couple of different techniques to try and a sense of how wet on wet works and how wet on dry works, and how mixing colors can make a difference, and the ideas of lights and shadows, and the ideas of the different values of light areas and then darker areas, and how the interplay between them helps draw the eye and add interest. So let me know if you have any questions about the watercolor crayon resist technique and about watercoloring in general. Alright, thank you for watching this section.